All right. Maybe we should get started right now. All right. So let me just welcome you to the Department of Planetary Sciences. I'm Joe Giacalone. I'm actually the associate department head in here in this department. And I'm going to hand it over to Elliot Chu to say a few words about the Blitzer Award. My job is to sort of welcome you, but I'd also like to say a couple words about the department here, primarily the educational aspect of this department. We've got a very long history educating the next generation of planetary scientists. It started basically when the department started. Well, when the lab started in 1960, there were a few graduate students that came with Gerard Kuiper at the time. 1973 was when Lunar and Planetary Lab, which had been under Kuiper's leadership, it became the Department of Planetary Sciences / Lunar and Planetary Laboratory in 1973. And we have a very thriving graduate program primarily. We have about 25 or so graduate students. We teach many graduate courses related to planetary sciences, very broadly defined. And we also teach undergraduate classes. We don't have an undergraduate major, but we do have a minor, so we have some advanced undergraduate classes that we teach. And we also teach in this particular room a large number of undergraduate, freshmen, and introductory type courses that are very, very popular, and we've been doing that with distinction for quite some time. So we've got a very thriving education program spanning undergraduate and graduate levels. Excuse me, Uwe? Do I need to be lower? I can't. Here, let me just use this one. Sorry, I can't bend down far enough. I'm just way too tall, obviously. Okay, do I need to repeat what I just said? Okay. Okay, good. Thank you, because I'm not so sure that I could. Anyways, okay, so that's in a nutshell. We teach at all different levels. We have the introductory courses that we teach, the advanced undergraduate courses that we teach, and we also have a thriving graduate program. We have a number of graduate students who are actually, many of which are present here today, so thank you for coming. Anyways, okay, so that's a little bit about the department, and I'm going to try not to take too much time. I think I'm going to hand it over to Elliot Chu, the Associate Dean of the College of Science, right now to say a few words about the Blitzer Award.
Thanks, Joe. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody here and thank you for attending. This is the 8th annual Leon and Pauline Blitzer Teaching Award. The award actually is named in honor of was given by the children of Leon and Pauline Blitzer. The first recipient was Johnny Shea from physics, and the award cycles through 4 departments. It is awarded to faculty in physics, atmospheric science, astronomy, and planetary science. So it spans kind of the interest of Leon throughout his career here at the U of A. As you can read this in the back, but I'll just give you a few salient points. Leon was a professor here. I believe he came here in 1946. And retired about 40 years later. So unfortunately, I didn't overlap with him, but some of the people in the crowd, and in fact, Dale Shellhorn just reminded me that he was a student of Leon's as one of the first research students here. You may not know, but in the 40s, certainly, the physics department was a teaching department. It was a support department for the rest of the university, and slowly started to gain more research. And so research has become, as you know, much more prominent both in the physics department and the other 3 departments that I mentioned. And he was a passionate teacher, and so while the award recognizes, and the speakers have all talked about the research they do, it also recognizes the fact that teaching was a really important part of his life and an important part of the College of Science. I want to recognize, and Charles will come up in a second, the 2 children of Leon Blitzer are Charles and Mimi Blitzer, and they've been generous donors to the university in order to support this award. And in fact, some of their children have actually attended here at the U of A also. So there's quite a long tradition at the U of A. So I want to thank the Blitzers very much for their generosity, and also congratulate Bill Hubbard for receiving this award. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Charles Blitzer. Oh, I'm sorry. I will introduce Randy. Sorry, I apologize. Randy Jacobi. You can tell I didn't read the agenda.
It's an honor for me to be here to congratulate Bill on the Blitzer Award. I should say that I had a personal relationship with Leon Blitzer for a while. It turns out that he and my PhD advisor at Caltech, Leverett Davis, wrote a book about exterior ballistics. And when I came here, Leverett was wanted to be sure that I would contact Leon. That wasn't necessary. Leon contacted me when I arrived and was a support when I first started here at Arizona. I also have known Bill Hubbard for a long time. Bill and I were on the faculty of this department when it was formed, or just shortly after it was formed. Bill actually was put on the faculty a year or so before I arrived, but then he went off to Moscow in the days when that wasn't very common to spend some time doing research there. Bill has taught, of course, been a very good teacher of both undergraduate and graduate teaching here at the department, and has advised a large number of very successful graduate students. So he certainly satisfies the prerequisites for the Blitzer Award. He's an excellent teacher. Bill has worked on a number of things. They're listed in the program. Equations describing the equation state of hydrogen in the interior of Jupiter. This is high pressure hydrogen. Stellar occultations. I worked with Bill. We wrote a couple papers on stellar occultations about 30 years ago. Rotating planets and their structure using the gravitational field, and extrasolar planets. I guess that's about all I can say. When I give a talk like this, I like to find some dirt on the recipient, just so we can have a little bit of humorous comment. And I looked up W.B. Hubbard online, and damn it, there's nothing dirty there. It's really, the closest thing was the Hubbard street dancers in Chicago. Have you heard of that, Bill? But that was just a bunch of young girls running around my TV screen. So with no further ado, I guess, should I introduce the speech? Okay, Bill is going to talk to us about the space. The award first. Oh, the award goes next. Okay, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Joe. Okay.
I'm Charles Blitzer. Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you so much, Planetary Science Department, for lending us not only this beautiful room, but one of your distinguished professors to be this year's awardee. And on behalf of my sister Mimi, who could not make it today, and myself, first, here's a little award.
Thank you.
Which I'm sure you'll find some way to usefully use. And perhaps more memorably, a little trophy for your desk or bookshelf.
Beautiful.
This event, this is the 8th or 9th, and it's been, I think, a great success in terms of the people and from the 4 departments, and how each of them combines what was so important to my father, strong research and commitment to teaching. And so happy, Bill, that you've got this award, and we look forward to hearing about why space.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm extremely happy to be able to talk about a subject that's dear to my heart, and which has been, I have to say, a little bit more than a hobby for me, although it's definitely not in my area of scientific research. But before I start, I think it would be appropriate to point out Leon Blitzer's role in the formation of the Department of Planetary Sciences, since that was not specifically alluded to. So there we go. Okay, so Gerard Kuiper became the founder of LPL, as has already been mentioned, in 1960, when he moved to the University of Arizona from his position as the director of Yerkes and McDonald Observatories at the University of Chicago. For over a decade, LPL was a research-only organization, although a few students obtained their PhDs through LPL, but the academic programs were in places like astronomy and physics and geosciences. Some distinguished early graduates I should mention are Dale Cruikshank, Bill Hartman, and Alan Binder. although their degrees were not in planetary sciences, which didn't have a degree program at that time. But by 1972, Kuiper was actively pressing for a department. And that spring, there was a meeting, first meeting of the committee for the department. And this is the committee for the Department of Planetary Sciences, formed in 1972. And you can read the membership, and you can see Leon Blitzer was one of our founders. And this group reported to Herman Bleibtreu, who was the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and we were under liberal arts at that time. And I thank Pat Romer for helping me to collect this historical information. I remembered that there was a committee, but I didn't know its precise membership. Also in 1972, Kuiper invited me out to Tucson to interview for a position in this new department. I accepted his offer, and I took up residence in the fall of 1972, and Pat Romer introduced me for the first time to Leon Blitzer. And then the Department of Planetary Sciences was chartered by the Arizona Board of Regents. Now, Leon was very influential in the education of our early graduate students. I received a few congratulatory messages when I learned about this award, and these are a couple that I thought I would share with you. I was on Mark Bowie's committee. Uwe Fink was his director, I believe, but Leon was also on Mark's committee with me. And Mark Marley is one of my successful former students, and he also was very impressed with Leon as a teacher. And one final thing I'll share with you, which is probably not general knowledge, which is that Leon actually came, I wouldn't say real close, but sort of close to becoming director here. In 1977, the directorship suddenly went vacant, and Blitzer's name did surface as a possible interim director, but instead they picked me. So I've been around here for 40 years, over 40 years, and that obviously spans the entire lifetime of our department. And moreover, I have witnessed the entire space age. I was a senior in high school when Sputnik was launched in October of 1957. And in 1959, about a year and a half after Sputnik, the summer after my freshman year in college, I worked as a summer intern at the University of Chicago's Yerkes Observatory, and I met my first planetary scientists there. So in this picture, here of course is Kuiper, and right above his head is me, and there is Robert Kraft. There's Peter Kuiper, Gerard's son. Over here is Di Arthur, I believe. Here is Ewan Whitaker, who is still around. Ewan Whitaker came here to Tucson with Gerard, and here is Dale Cruikshank, by now a very famous planetary scientist. Here's Alan Binder, who's not quite so well known, but he was the PI on the first Discovery mission, Lunar Prospector, and his mission was the first to report evidence of water on the moon. So here are my credentials for this talk. I will mention a few aspects from my research, but I'm primarily going to be talking about space history. And I'm neither a historian nor a political scientist. I'm just a working scientist. But while applying my trade as a teacher, as an investigator, as a member of NASA and NSF advisory committees, I've had the opportunity to study the space enterprise. And so here are my thoughts. Consider the following proposition. Okay, I think if you were to ask a planetary scientist or an astronomer, they would say, yeah, it's self-evident. But I think we should perhaps entertain the thought that our thinking is like that of the fleas on a dog. The natural order of things has arranged everything for our comfort and nourishment. History shows that space exploration is driven by other factors. It's driven by imagination and fantasy, by international conflict, military and otherwise, and by the search for competitive advantage, sometimes in the most sinister form. The main point of my talk is that we have been fortunate so far, that the outcome of these forces has so far been very broadly beneficial to mankind, not just to science. But we have to bear in mind this may be largely the result of luck rather than planning, and that things may change. The first major driving force to consider is sheer imagination. As expressed in science fiction and fantasy, imagination outstrips the laws of physics but reflects a real hunger. The very words heavens, Himmel, nieba, los cielos suggests a place that is worth exploring. Anecdotally, when I chat with people outside of academia, in an airplane, in a waiting room, in a pasture, and they ask me, what do you do? And I tell them, they often hear the response, what neat stuff? And nowadays there are very few federal agencies that are held in general esteem. But unlike the IRS, NASA appears to be liked. Now, there are exceptions to that. My colleague Alfred McEwen has pointed out to me that that might not be true of NASA employees. The first realistic fictional description of a space voyage was Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, published in 1865. And what is noteworthy about this book is that it's very prescient description of the circumstances that would actually send Americans to the moon. Like his countryman de Tocqueville, Verne provided a perceptive, foreign-based view of what makes U.S. society tick. In his narrative, it would be military technology honed to a sharp edge by a recent conflict, which would propel the first lunar mission. Verne was somewhat literate in celestial mechanics. He was aware of the immense kinetic energies involved in orbital motion. To reach the moon with Civil War technology, one needed a giant artillery piece to fire a projectile at the moon. Americans would be just the nationality to relish such a challenge. What was needed was a huge cannon drilled and cast into the earth at a low-latitude site facing an ocean to the east, such as Florida. There would be some jockeying between states, specifically Florida and Texas, to host the mission. From a societal point of view, national jingoism would play a role. Much science fiction in the early 20th century continued to reflect the view that exploring and colonizing other planets was the manifest destiny of humanity in general, and Americans in particular. One of the first Arizona astronomers, Percival Lowell, helped to popularize the view that Mars was inhabited by alien beings just hanging on by irrigating a dying desert planet. One of our planetary science colleagues, Kevin Zonley, recently went out of his way to debunk Lowell's mythology in a reputable scientific journal. A later sci-fi writer, Ray Bradbury, saw Mars as a now lifeless place, haunted by extinct creatures. There was an intriguing kernel of truth in all of this nonsense, and we continue to explore Mars looking for life, or at least extinct life. We honor Bradbury as a source of poetic inspiration for the scientific exploration of Mars. Other science fiction writers, Arthur C. Clarke in particular, laid out a blueprint for how space exploration was going to proceed. Like Verne, Clarke was technically literate, and his concept of geosynchronous satellite orbits bears his name. This is from a recent Wall Street Journal, and here the belt of geosynchronous satellites is labeled the Clarke Belt. Now, much of the science fiction of the early 20th century was pretty ridiculous. I recall as a child watching jerky black and white 1930s era Flash Gordon Saturday morning serials in a seedy old theater in Columbia. They didn't have TV there, so this was our best option. And these episodes usually pitted Flash against an evil villain named Ming the Merciless. Well, the early days of real space exploration were not sublime, and they did involve merciless villains. The story is complicated, though, involving a combination of technical virtuosity, ruthlessness, and even heroism. In this remarkable historical photo from 1941, we see the brilliant rocket engineer Wernher von Braun at the Peenemünde test site in Germany with a number of other personages, including Walter Dornberger, who is also in civilian clothes here on the left, who participated later on in the U.S. space program and was instrumental in helping in introducing concepts for the space shuttle. This other general here in the front is Friedrich Ulbricht, who in 1944 led an unsuccessful coup attempt against the Nazis and was executed. In the waning days of World War II, the U.S. Army sent a number of scientists into just liberated Germany to gather up German scientists and equipment before the Soviets did, the so-called Alsace mission. One such scientist was the Dutch-American astronomer Gerard Kuiper. Here is an account of conditions that were witnessed. Imagine the dumb wonder of the American lieutenant who bumped into the Mittelwerk. There, on railway cars leading into the bowels of the earth, were gigantic rockets lined up like imports from Mars. And inside, a gutted mountain, bizarre machinery, slaves like living skeletons, a scene from Flash Gordon. Nearby, they found the workers' camp and thousands of corpses, human sacrifices on the altar of machines and power. The German A-4 rocket, known to the military as the V-2, was an unprecedented vehicle designed by Wernher von Braun. Von Braun's team had detailed designs for further versions, A5 through A8. The A9 and A10 were multi-stage rockets with an intended range of 5,000 kilometers, true ICBMs. The A11 was meant for Earth orbit, and the A12 would be capable of orbiting a man with a 30-ton payload. Von Braun surrendered to the Americans. He was exonerated from complicity in the horrific slave labor used to build the V-2s. But Kuiper was not so sure he was innocent. During his Alsace mission, Kuiper had picked up a whip in a concentration camp. He described to me how he had once brandished it in von Braun's face. Von Braun did not react. Post-war, von Braun became a key member of the U.S. space program, the U.S. rocket team, and he was the principal designer of the mighty Saturn moon rocket. Here is the model rocket which he gave to Kuiper, and which used to stand in Kuiper's office here at LPL, and which is now, I believe, in the custody of the Flandau Science Center. Von Braun had a counterpart, an anonymous rocket designer, a slave laborer in the Soviet Union, Soviet prison system, named Sergei Korolyov. This Russian aerospace engineer was picked up by the secret police during one of the great Stalin purges of the 1930s, and he was imprisoned in the Gulag system. His health was broken doing manual labor under horrific conditions, but he somehow survived. Later, he was allowed to do design work in a prison laboratory, a so-called sharashka of the type memorialized by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the novel The First Circle. Korolyov's counterpart to von Braun's V-2 was the R-7, the world's first ICBM. No one in the United States saw it coming. The launch of Sputnik in October, it was on October 4th, 1957, on the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It caused what could only be described as panic in the United States. We were supposed to be first. Something was fundamentally wrong with our system. We had fallen behind the Soviets in technology across a broad front. We were not educating enough scientists and engineers. If nothing were done, space would belong to centrally planned Marxism. So here are some lines from the classic movie The Right Stuff, which I recommend as one of the few Hollywood movies which actually depicts space exploration more or less correctly. This is from and in turn it's adapted from the classic Tom Wolfe book. This is in this scene, the Senate Majority Leader of the time, this is in 1957, Lyndon Johnson, is in an Oval Office meeting with President Eisenhower. And Johnson speaks, and I will allow you to read those lines. Now, as a Texan, I can do Lyndon Johnson, but in this movie, he's portrayed by a British actor, and I cannot do a Brit trying to do a Texan. Okay, but so at this point, one could, if I were teaching an undergraduate class, I would ask for a show of hands about whether this is nonsense or not. And I'm not going to do that, but I'll tell you the answer, or at least my answer, very shortly. But note that spoken in the proper cultured British accent, almost any proposition sounds reasonable. And conversely, when spoken in a Texas drawl, it may sound preposterous to some, except maybe to Texans. But actually, everybody at the time thought Johnson's position was correct. But luckily, it has turned out to be nonsense, at least for the time. And this is not because the Soviets weren't looking for military advantage in space as well as everywhere else, but because Earth orbit turns out to be quite unsuitable as a weapons base. That may change, but that's the way it is. And what it is suitable for is surveillance, both in toward the Earth and outward into deep space. And surveillance is militarily stabilizing. It makes secret massing of troops impossible. It reveals weapons testing. And so for the world, this was luck. There were some more lucky circumstances at the start of the space age. At the beginning, the United States planned to have a civilian space program run by a civilian agency, NASA, which was established by Eisenhower in 1958. But the launch vehicle to be used for our initial sallies into space was I'll use the adjective pitiful, woebegone, Vanguard rocket, shown here in the National Aerospace Museum. This was a photograph taken by my TA at the time, Catherine Niche. This was to illustrate some of the points I made in my lecture. And it was prone to failure, and it was capable of launching only the smallest payloads. The first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, was successfully launched with the rocket on the right, the Jupiter C rocket, which was a military rocket. But neither of these rockets had the payload capacity of the R-7. And as everyone knows, the premium on low-mass, compact, reliable space instrumentation spurred the development of microelectronics. The Soviets had the luxury of Korolyov's R-7, which was capable of orbiting multi-ton payloads, and therefore they could use vacuum tube electronics and old-fashioned film cameras. Now there's an even greater benefit of Sputnik, which is less well known, perhaps. And that is that despite the public hand-wringing, many U.S. officials were delighted that Sputnik was orbiting over U.S. territory with no advance permission having been sought. The principle was thereby established: national sovereignty ends with the atmosphere. And you can imagine the armies of lawyers and diplomats working for years negotiating treaties had it not happened this way. So, when did this Cold War end? Some would say, I think most people would say, when the Soviet Union ended in 1991. But I would say it ended in space much sooner. And I would say in 1973. I say that because I was in Russia for that welcome development. The previous year at the Moscow summit, in the wake of Nixon's historic China visit, President Nixon, Secretary of State Kissinger, and General Secretary Brezhnev discussed cooperation in space, among other aspects of détente. In 1973, 3 young planetary scientists participated in a scientific exchange program that was arranged between the National Academy of Sciences of the United States and the Soviet Academy of Sciences. These were Joe Burns, Dale Cruikshank, and myself. At first, well, let me show you a picture made at the time. The So it was kind of hard. You see the three refugees from Tucson here in the foreground. This is my wife, and these are my two daughters, now grown with their own family. And we had trouble equipping ourselves for the Russian winter, so we made a trip to Flagstaff to get these blue down-filled jackets, which worked pretty well. We stopped in Helsinki to buy lap boots for the kids, and then Lucy Kuiper made her coat available to my wife. So we were not exactly fashion plates over there, and the kids certainly stuck out in the Soviet kindergarten. But at first my visit was pretty tense when I got there. Joe's host, I'll show you the two of the scientific hosts here. Joe's host was Viktor Safronov. Now, Viktor Safronov is well known to planetary scientists as a theoretical investigator of the process of planet formation. He's now deceased. He was a loyal member of the Communist Party, and he was allowed to travel abroad quite freely without the usual escort of KGB minders. But my host was Vladimir Zharkov, and he was suspect because his father had been purged in one of the Stalin purges of the 1930s, and he had to actually abandon his father's surname in order to seek anonymity. His office at the Geophysical Institute, no doubt, was heavily bugged. It was right next door to the Institute's KGB office. And at first I despaired that I would be able to accomplish anything during my 6-month stay. But midway through my visit, the Nixon-Brezhnev agreement finally percolated down to the Schmidt Institute, and the new watchword was Sotrudnichestvo, which is cooperation. And so once the green light was given, we wrote papers and we freely discussed science. And 2 years later, the last Apollo mission turned out to be the first space station mission. This was the Apollo-Soyuz mission. Here is a variant of the R-7, the Semyorka, photograph I made myself. This is the Vostok version. Here is the Cosmos version launching the Soyuz space capsule, and here is a mission patch showing the union of these two satellites. This orbital rendezvous, which occurred in 1975, was the ancestor of the International Space Station. So, was Lyndon Johnson's sinister scenario only a passing nightmare? Well, not quite. Just before my departure, my Russian colleagues told me that they had been asked to study the possibility of detonating Jupiter, turning it into a doomsday device. Straight out of Dr. Strangelove. To an astrophysicist, this doesn't sound totally crazy at first, when one first hears about it, because under what are called electron-degenerate conditions, dense hydrogen can undergo a thermonuclear runaway, and this is what makes novas explode. When I returned to Tucson, I was interviewed by a CIA agent as a routine matter, but I said nothing to him about the Jupiter bomb idea. The only person I told was Kuiper. And this veteran of Alsace had the following response. He said, "That is," and I can't do his Dutch accent, "that is the sort of bizarre idea that you would expect from a totalitarian state." A few months later, at the end of 1973, Kuiper was gone. He died of a heart attack on the steps of a Mexican pyramid, somehow an appropriate end to a great planetary scientist. Turns out that Jupiter cannot explode. In the 1980s, a Livermore group found that it was not massive enough, and our research group here found that the mass limit for deuterium ignition was 13 Jupiter masses. Bringing this account full circle, last year I was invited to speak at Space Fest, and Space Fest may be familiar to some of you. It is a gathering of space enthusiasts, and it was at Star Pass last year. It will be again this year over the Memorial Day weekend. One sees not only scientists there, people from LPL and so on giving talks about their missions, but also astronauts and space artists. So to prepare for my talk, which I gave about the Juno-Jupiter mission, which was launched in 2011 and will arrive at Jupiter in 2016, I decided to compare this Juno mission with Arthur C. Clarke's vision of a Jupiter mission which is called 2010 Odyssey 2, which was written in 1982. And this was when the Cold War was still going on. And Clarke dedicated his book to Andrei Sakharov, the chief designer of the Soviet H-bomb, who with his wife Yelena Bonner had gone into full dissidency at that point. Clarke had been in touch with Sakharov, and his book portrayed a peaceful future with a 2010 joint Soviet-American spacecraft voyaging to Jupiter. The book ends with the ignition of Jupiter, turning it into a second sun by adding about 10 times more mass. So these are some lines from his book, and he actually had the right number in there, and of course where you would get 10 Jupiter masses to add to Jupiter is left unexplained in his book. But he clearly had been talking to someone who had done the calculations, which had to have been Sakharov. So unlike Clarke's fictional mission, our Jupiter mission is not crewed, and we have no Russia-based investigators on our science team. But ironically, there is an important Russian component. The Atlas V launch vehicle, which is used by the New Frontiers mission to Pluto, by Juno, and by Mars Curiosity rover, and several other NASA deep space missions, has a first-stage rocket motor that is made in Russia. It is a direct descendant of Korolyov's Sputnik rocket. The main supply line to the International Space Station is Russian rocket launches, as you know. And some of my colleagues think that the ISS is fantastically expensive, that it produces little science, and that it is a waste of resources in general. But I have a different opinion. I consider the ISS an important symbol of international cooperation, a realization of Clarke's dream of the future, a seamless continuation of the first defusing of the Cold War. It matters to the Russians, it should matter to us, and it matters to every nation on Earth. I might mention that just last, so here is the International Space Station and the participating nations and Arthur C. Clarke's first visualization of space stations published back in the 50s. I might also mention that Mexico has just formed a space agency, and some of us here at LPL had the opportunity to lunch with this gentleman who was telling us what they had in mind. So there is really no plausible scenario for the future without space exploration. And I'd now like to focus down on the University of Arizona. Chuck Sonnet was the first planetary science department head and the second LPL director following Kuiper. And when we were just getting started, he told me of a conversation that he had with Al Weaver. Al Weaver was the vice president for research at the time, what would now be called the provost. And here's what Weaver told Sonnet, and Sonnet relayed to me. The university needs an English department, needs a math department, a physics department, etc. We don't need your planetary sciences department. Therefore, your department has to be very, very good. Now, times are different from 1973. Once again, we are in a Sputnik moment. We have, as you can see, these numbers, which are taken from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, we have dropped in rank rather precipitously. Our production of PhDs in engineering and physical science areas is down 22% over the last 10 years. We are on the cusp of a major shift in the university paradigm. To give you an example, I just read an article in Wired magazine with a Harvard Business School economist who notes that the Harvard Business School doesn't teach accounting anymore because elsewhere there are excellent online courses in that subject. My interpretation, reading that article, is that the future belongs to hybrid departments offering unique world-class specializations and who are very, very good. Like the best science fiction writers, Kuiper saw the future coming. And I have one final endnote here, and this is not a shill for tomorrow's talk, but this came in the mail, in the email just yesterday. So if you're cynical, you could say that what you just heard was a long infomercial for the ISS. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think we could entertain some questions from the audience. Surely that was a very enlightening historical perspective on the space program. Yes?
At the beginning of your talk, you had a quote about the self-evidence of the exploration of space being the most sublime human activity. Who were you quoting there?
I was quoting myself. I was trying to figure out what would be the most fatuous statement of the self-involved priorities of astronomers and planetary scientists, and that was what I came up with. So it was intended tongue-in-cheek, but it's maybe not so bad.
Other questions? Yes?
What do you see as the top priorities in the area of space exploration?
It's really going to be driven by the public, I think. I think that the public will tell by basically telling Congress what they're excited by, what turns them on. As I said, I think the public finds what NASA and the larger space enterprise is doing quite fascinating. And the search for life is something that everyone is quite involved with. I think it's beginning to look like there's some hope that maybe Mars might actually reveal something which will tell us something about the origin of life on Earth. So Mars is clearly going to be a major focus. The other exciting thing that's going on, which is something that Kuiper never visualized, I certainly didn't see coming until quite recently, was the discovery of exoplanets. Exoplanets, the way we're investigating exoplanets right now is kind of analogous to the way that Kuiper and his colleagues were investigating the solar system back in the 50s with telescopes and nothing else. Of course, we're not going to have missions to exoplanets, but we have so much better instrumentation. I think we're going to have a very exciting period of time where we learn more about how Earths are formed and how living planets develop.
Other questions? Yes?
My political goals and scientific goals were what? Yeah, I learned a lot. I actually, the people that I was working with, Russians, there's a long tradition in Russia of excellent mathematics, and they developed theoretical methods for investigating planetary problems that were quite impressive. And some of the things that they were working on were things like the solutions for the structure of highly rotating planets like Jupiter. And those techniques that I learned there are still very useful to me today in the work that I'm doing today. So some of those, a lot of that work was quite seminal.
Yes.
Could you comment on your future role of private enterprise in developing the space
Right. Yeah. That's an extremely important development. It needs to happen that way. One cynical comment that I read years ago was that the U.S. responded to the Sputnik challenge by setting up a Soviet-style agency to compete with the Soviets, i.e. NASA. Now, I think that was a little unfair, but certainly the process needs to be opened up. The development, commercialization of space, in my opinion, is still a long way down the road, but there's some motion in that direction. But the development of basically profit-making launch vehicles is now surging ahead, and there is a little known. I don't know how many people have read the Augustine report. This was a commission under Norman Augustine that went to work in '09, right at the beginning of the Obama administration, which basically made some recommendations about what should be done in the manned space program, but also by inference to the rest of the program. And one of their recommendations was that private industry should play a larger role in the development of launch vehicles. And as far as I can tell, the Obama administration is following those recommendations quite closely.
Yes. Right.
Do you think that privatization of space flight will phase out government agencies, or do you think that they'll collaborate in the future or coexist?
Well, there's still a need for government agencies because some of the research doesn't have obvious application to commercialization. But I see that a much larger role for private enterprise in the space enterprise.
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting that you envisioned the future of academics being in this hybrid learning space, and I thought that was a great forward-thinking thought. And I wonder what a hybridization of new knowledge in space is going to look like. So if we're thinking about crafting knowledge, it could be in interdisciplinary forms, or it could be in these leveraging of private-public partnerships. What does that mean for the field, this field, LPL in particular? What are new dimensions of hybridization, forms that knowledge is going to be produced?
We don't know in detail the answer to that question, but what we have been very careful about in developing our graduate program and hiring new faculty is to try to maintain as broad an interdisciplinary balance as we can. We are looking for excellent scientists, but we don't want to basically focus down on very narrow areas. We think that that's not the way to go. So it'll have to develop on its own. We are not going to dictate the direction that the department should focus on.
Sure. Go ahead.
Questions that you think that might be more attractive to those kind of interdisciplinary collaborations?
The obvious one that right now is sort of coming to the fore is exoplanets, which involve so many different disciplines. And I might add that one of the benefits that I've observed in the discovery of exoplanets is that back in the days of Kuiper's primary activity, before the space age really got going, he was one of the few planetary scientists who was working in the field. Most astrophysicists thought planetary science was a backwater where not much had happened since the early 19th century, and that nothing was going to happen there. But that has certainly been turned around now. It's a very fashionable area in astrophysics as well as in planetary science. So we're going to have quite a broadening of interest across various scientific disciplines.
Yes.
You didn't speak much about planetary protection as a driver for space exploration, but given the impact of Russia this month on the same day as we had a very close encounter with an asteroid, maybe you could reflect on that and how that's been motivating us moving forward.
Yeah, well, that's I think something that was sort of made its point without us having to belabor it. The Chelyabinsk impact was very dramatic and totally unexpected, of course. and it demonstrated better than anything else could have the power of orbital energy. So planetary protection, when I teach a course in here, I try to impress upon the students where the risks come from, and so I ask for a show of hands, and I start with asking how many of you know somebody who was killed in an auto accident, and about half the class raised their hand, which is a very sobering thing. And then I ask how many were killed, and how many of you know somebody who was killed in a plane accident, and there'll be a few. How many of you know somebody who was killed by an asteroid? And then some clown will stick his hand up. But that kind of demonstrates the level of threat. But on the other hand, that's kind of a meaningless comparison, because asteroids obviously the product of the probability and the consequences is still a pretty significant number. And so everyone realizes that's something that needs to be kept track of. But the other important aspect of it, of course, is arms control, because whenever there is an explosion like that, it could, in principle, trigger a war. And so the fact that we know what it was right off the bat is a very stabilizing thing.
Okay. Are there other questions? I might ask one, actually. I often run across one of the most common issues about why we have a space program is to separate the manned part versus the robotic exploration of the solar system. Okay, so the next, we've orbited the planet. Next, perhaps, is or setting up a moon base and perhaps sending a man to Mars. When do you think that might happen?
Well, as you know, as Randy here knows well, the big problem, the big unsolved problem for that type of mission is the effect of solar storms. Ionizing radiation coming from the sun, but also elsewhere in the galaxy. And it appears, in retrospect, that the Apollo astronauts were lucky that they weren't that they didn't suffer lethal doses during their trips, because it could have happened. And if you undertake a 500-day journey, say, to Mars, your chances of having that happen would be quite large, and no one knows how to effectively protect against that.
Okay, so you don't think it's going to happen then?
Well, that problem has to be solved first, I think. Okay. I don't know how it's going to be solved.
Okay, are there any other questions? I think we have time for one more burning question, if anybody has one. Yes?
I was going to ask him privately, since we have to run out of time. You showed a slide that shows that we're 60th. Could you go back to that slide? You said that we declined our position, and there it is, 60th in the world of science.
I think that's in proportion to population. So, yeah. So, we're just not quite as bad as it could be, but it's still pretty bad.
And the degrees have dropped in the last 10 years. We've seen a general decline in interest in science in the United States, and declining scores. Can you say anything about what we're going to do to reverse that, or what we need to be thinking about to get more interest?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was a student, when I was entering college, and Sputnik had just happened, I felt it was my patriotic duty to study science. And, that was kind of maybe a corny reason to do it, but that's what I felt I should do. I don't know whether everybody was similarly motivated, but maybe we need to get that spirit going again.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and congratulations again, Bill. And
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you. And